So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. So we had a series of lectures on this text already, and we've seen how some of the fundamental issues with this book is how the female subject is being coerced into a certain kind of cure method. The female subject is bereft of agency. Female subject is bereft of any kind of sort of assertion of agency, and also how the entire medical treatment is so masculinist in quality, it's so patriarchal in quality, and how there's a very complete collusion between patriarchy and medical science over here, which is to say how the female subject is sort of denied any dignity to a certain extent. So the male figure, the husband, doctor, John, in this particular novella, doesn't even take the female protagonist seriously. I mean, he doesn't even consider her to be really or seriously sick. Right, so and that's something which is obviously part of the patriarchal treatment of the hysteric, the female hysteric. So that's something that we keep saying throughout this text. Okay, so and then we talked about how this came out of a direct experience of postpartum psychosis, which is a post-pregnancy condition. And that's something which is obviously quite palpable throughout this text. I mean, there's this presence of this baby who never appears directly, but then the baby is always there as a presence, as a background presence, and we're told about the baby all the time. So there's this reference to the baby in the text over here, and I'm just going to read out the section which should be on your screen, where the female protagonist, the narrator, says, "There's one comfort, the baby is well and happy, and does not have to occupy this nursery with a horrid wallpaper." So the wallpaper obviously is just more than a material over here. It becomes metaphorical, and this conversion from materiality to metaphoricity is something which happens throughout the text. And we also see how at the beginning of the text, the female protagonist has this aversion towards the wallpaper. And by the time the text ends, that aversion converts into association. I mean, she sees herself in the wallpaper, essentially. The female figure trapped in the wallpaper turns out to be her, in a very symbolic sort of psychological maneuver. So we find that that she's saying there's one comfort, and this should be on the screen, there's one comfort, the baby is well and happy and does not have to occupy this nursery with a horrid wallpaper. If we had not used it, what blessed child would have? That blessed child would have, and what a fortunate escape. Why, I wouldn't have a child of mine, an impressionable little thing, live in such a room for worlds. So she's saying that it's a good thing that I'm living in this room after all, because otherwise the baby would have had to shift away. This would have been the nursery otherwise. And I can't bear the thought of the baby looking at this wallpaper, this horrid wallpaper, all the time. So it's a good thing that I'm looking at it and I'm suffering it rather than the baby. And then she goes on to say, I never thought of it before, but it is lucky that John kept me here at all. After all, I can stand it so much easier than a baby, you see. Of course, I never mention it to them anymore. I am too wise, but I keep watch of it all the same. There are things in that paper that nobody knows but me or ever will. So this is the beginning of the association that she has with the wallpaper. So as I mentioned, the movement is from affiliation, from aversion to association, from aversion to affiliation. So she starts getting more and more affiliated to the wallpaper. Okay. And then she says, behind that outside pattern, the dim shapes get clearer every day. It is always the same shape, only very numerous. And it's like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind the pattern. I don't like it a bit. I wonder, I begin to think, I wish John would take me away from here. So the whole idea of finding the woman, or finding the figure of a woman in the wallpaper beneath the patterns, is the beginning of the association that she has with the wallpaper. That's something that we get to see. And then we are told, it is so hard to talk with John about my case because he is so wise and because he loves me so. So you can see the word love over here is used very ironically, and that's part of the almost satirical quality in this particular voice. And she's saying that, it's difficult for me to talk to John about my condition because he loves me so much. And I wonder, normally, commonsensically, if someone loves another person very much, then obviously the person would feel comfortable talking about her condition to him. But the fact that love over here is a very loaded word, is part of the patriarchal caregiving package, is part of the patriarchal coercion narrative, the patriarchal control narrative. That love becomes a bit of a protecting, controlling, coercing kind of a maneuver, and that prevents her from talking about her condition to him. And she says quite clearly that I don't talk to him because A, he's very wise, and B, he loves me so much. So wisdom And love, in a patriarchal sense, is obviously conferred on the figure of the authority over here, which happens to be the medical male figure. Okay, and then she said that I tried it last night. I tried to talk to him last night about my condition. So we see how throughout this text we have a crisis in communication, which is sort of shaping up and which is beginning to get more and more palpable as it progresses, as the narrative progresses. And then, she says quite clearly that, John was asleep and I hated to waken him. So I kept still and watched the moonlight on that undulating wallpaper till I felt creepy. So there was a sense of fear, a sense of menace that came with the wallpaper, that came with the idea of looking at the wallpaper at moonlight. And she says that I felt creepy because, the wallpaper began to have a undulating shape of its own. So it's almost becoming more and more organic in quality, that fear of the wallpaper. The wallpaper itself is becoming more organic in quality. It's becoming more human-like in quality. So you have a very interesting, dynamic operative over here. So the wallpaper, the thing, the material is becoming more dynamic, it's becoming more palpable and more organic, whereas the husband, who happens to be a human being, is becoming more and more detached and mechanical from the subject. So, she's sort of gravitating towards the wallpaper to a certain extent. She's moving towards the wallpaper emotionally, and she finds more emotionally connect. I mean, at this level, at this point, it's probably aversion, but even aversion is a sense of association. It's a negative association, but it's still association. And that is beginning to sort of not just consume her, but also overdetermine the way she's thinking. And then we are told quite clearly that she sees the faint figure behind seemed to shake the pattern, just as if she wanted to get out. So, we can see how she's beginning to see a female figure behind the pattern, and she can also see how the female figure is beginning or trying to get out of the wallpaper. Right, and this obviously we know that by the time the story would end, that a female figure would happen to be her, and when she will dismantle the wallpaper symbolically, that would symbolically mean emancipating her, and she'd sort of step out of the wallpaper as it was. So the female figure would come out of the wallpaper in the same way that she would come out of the coercion space, the coercion narrative that she's been subjected to by the medical figure of authority, who also happens to be her husband. Okay, so I got up softly and went to feel and see if the paper did move, and when I came back, John was awake. "What is it, little girl?" he said. "Don't go walking about like that, you'll get cold." So, if you look at the tone of John over here, the tone is very, very patronizing, a very patriarchal way, addressing her as a little girl and advising her not to go out at night. "Oh, he'll get cold, she'll get cold." So it becomes a word, a voice of advising, a voice of wisdom in a way, which is obviously quite patronizing and condescending to a large extent. And he's sort of essentially telling her that, if you go out in the night, you'll get colds and that's unsafe for you. You should be guarded, etc. So it comes from a point of privilege, a position of privilege, a position of superiority, which assumes authority because he happens to have medical knowledge. But we see how this kind of medical knowledge and medical narrative is completely bereft of empathy, is completely lacking in empathy. So in a very interesting sense, this becomes a critique of medicine and medical narratives. This becomes a critique of the cure narratives, which do not have any empathy quotient, which do not have any human quotient attached to them. Okay, so, and then she tells him quite clearly, and she says, "I thought it was a good time to talk, so I told him that I really was on gaining here, and that I wished he would take me away." And then he replies to that request. "Why, darling," said he, "our lease will be up in 3 weeks, and I can't see how we leave before." So, it's all very contractual for him. It's all very empirical for him. So we see this contractual, empirical, material markers which are conferred on the irrational man. And then, the rational man fails to understand the hysteric way out. The hysteric, of course, is a classification given very conveniently to the woman. And then he fails to understand, or doesn't attempt to understand or communicate with the female subject over here, who essentially suffers from that condition all the time, right? And then we told that he tells her quite clearly that she should trust him because he's a figure of authority. And this is obviously on the screen where he's saying, "I am a doctor, dear, and I know you are gaining flesh and color. Your appetite is better. I feel really much easier about you." So he's speaking from a position of privilege. He's telling her essentially that I speak as a doctor, I speak as a medical authority, and I'm telling you that you are better already. And I'm telling you that this is something which is good for you. You're gaining weight, you're getting more and more color in your countenance, and that's good for you. And you can take my word. You should take my word for it. Okay. And then she responds by saying, "I don't weigh a bit more," said I, "nor as much, and my appetite may be better in the evening when you are here, but it's worse in the morning when you're away." And so there's a complete conflict in communication. He is telling her that he knows that she is better. So he can also know for her. He can also tell her things about herself, medically, existentially, and she is refusing to buy into the narrative. She's saying that I don't feel better, and I may be gaining weight. I don't know if I'm gaining weight, but my appetite is only periodical. It's very periodic in quality. It comes and goes. And then, obviously, he continues this patronizing narrative by saying, "Bless her little heart," he said he with a big heart. "She shall be as sick as she pleases. But now let's improve the shining hours by going to sleep and talk about it in the morning." So, he's procrastinating, he's deferring this discussion, and he's deliberately deferring this discussion because he doesn't want to avoid it, and does want to avoid it. And he's being evasive in a very, very offensive kind of way. So this, you find, even look at the communication in this particular story, you find the communication is very gendered in quality. The male figure already knows everything. The male figure claims to know everything. The male figure doesn't want to listen to the narrative of the female figure, the female subject. And then, the male figure will speak for her. The male figure will decide for her. And the male figure will also feel for her. I mean, he will tell her that this is how you are feeling. So we can see how this complete negation or decimation of agency, which should be with the female figure. So she doesn't have any control of her own body. She's not supposed to know about her feelings. So someone else is supposed to know about her feelings more than she does. That's something which happens throughout this text. So again, we can see how a similar kind of a tension was operative even in Tulips, where we had a situation where the female figure in Tulips was confined in a hospital space, Silver Plus Tulips, and then she didn't have any agency. She saw nurses come and go, taking care of her, but essentially confining her in a space which is getting more and more claustrophobic in quality. So that claustrophobia is obviously experiential in quality. I mean, she's experiencing it phenomenally, emotionally, existentially, but also it's part of the discursive apparatus of containment and confinement. So that claustrophobia is part of the male apparatus and the male medical apparatus to contain and confine the female sufferer over here, who is conveniently classified as a hysteric over here. Okay, so you find, we skip a little bit and we come to the point where she's beginning to get emotionally attached to the wallpaper, and she's beginning to humanize the wallpaper in a way that it becomes more and more human-like for her. And also she gets a sense of empathy with the wallpaper. So and this is interesting because the only empathy that she's able to establish in the story is with a thing. And it starts from aversion, but then it becomes association through a process of empathy. And we find how there's a complete crisis in empathy, there's a complete collapse of empathy, as it were, with the other human beings around her, right? So, and she hovers and gravitates towards the things over here. So wallpaper here becomes a thing, the only object of empathy that she subjectifies to a certain extent. And then she says how it gets more and more sensory for her, where she's saying, and this should be on the screen, but there's something else about the paper, the smell. I noticed it the moment we came into the room, but with so much air and sun, it was no bad. Now we have had a week of fog and rain, and whether these windows are open or not, the smell is here. It creeps all over the house. I find it hovering in the dining room, skulking in the parlor, hiding in the hall, lying in wait for me on the stairs. It gets into my hair. So how the smell becomes almost a figure over here. The smell becomes material, and the smell becomes something which moves through the house. And she says that I find the smell entering my system, entering my hair, in the dining hall, and everywhere. So it basically conquers and invades all the spaces that we have in this house. Even when I go to ride, even when I turn my head suddenly and surprise it, there is that smell. Such a peculiar odor too. I've spent hours in trying to analyze it and find what it smelled like. It is not bad at first and very gentle, but quite the subtlest, most endearing odor I ever met. Now I find the adjectives are changing. It's gentle, subtle, and enduring, and it begins to take a human quality over here, which is interesting because that human quality is missing in the human figures that she's experiencing around her, who don't really have any connect with her, who don't really have any empathetic connection with her at all. In this damp weather, it is awful. I wake up in the night and find it hanging over me. It used to disturb me at first. I thought seriously of burning the house to reach the smell. So the whole idea of violence becomes important over here, and how you find that violence and affiliation become quite interestingly and problematically proximate with each other. How she's wanting to burn the house in order to reach the smell, in order to arrive and occupy and possess the smell. But now I'm used to it. The only thing I can think of that is like, it's like the color of the paper, a yellow smell. Now, at this point, I must stop and talk a little bit about something called synesthesia. And what is synesthesia? Synesthesia is that condition where different sensory perceptions crisscross with each other. So essentially what she's saying over here, that it's a yellow smell. Now, normally yellow, the color yellow, would appeal to a visual sensation. But over here, the color yellow also appeals to the smell, the olfactory sensation. And this crisscrossing of sensations, when you can smell a color, touch a color, or maybe see a smell, that all that becomes part of the synesthesia mechanism, where you basically begin to dissolve away in these different sense perceptions, and they all begin to merge together in very interesting ways. Because and that can become a heightened sensory condition, that can become a heightened sentient condition. It can also happen due to an aberration of your normal motor or cognitive mechanism. But in either way, it is an extraordinary cognitive experience, where you begin to smell colors, when you begin to touch smells, where you begin to hear colors. So all different kinds of sense perceptions crisscross with each other. So synesthesia is something that we should pay some attention to. And if you're more interested in the topic, you can look it up. There's a lot of really interesting research done on synesthesia from the perspective of psychology, of course, cognitive psychology, but also literature. And synesthesia becomes one of the key connections between literature and psychology, because even literature, we find they use in metaphors. It can also be sometimes synesthetic in quality, because using one thing to talk about something else, right? So that interpolation or that transposition of objects and attributes in literature, which is a very common trope in figurative language, that can sometimes open up in terms of describing synesthetic experiences. And synesthesia over here is a very important experience that is being described. A yellow smell. So the smell is yellow. The smell has a color over here. There is a very funny mark on this wall, low down near the mop board. A streak that runs around the room. It goes behind every piece of furniture except the bed, a long, straight, even smooch, as if it had been rubbed over and over. I wonder how it was done and who did it and what they did it for. Round and round and round, round and round and round, it makes me dizzy. So you can see the word round coming all over again. Round and round and round, round and round and round, it makes me dizzy. So there's a sense of movement over here, a dizzying movement, something which is not very healthy. But also, see, this is part of the synesthesia package. This is part of the aberration package. So what she's experiencing over here is a sense of sensory explosion, a sense of sensory aberration, which is also heightened in quality. And that is obviously non-normative in quality. So she's completely located at a sensory level in a non-normative position. And so that makes it, that makes her the complete other, the perfect other for the rational medical husband, who refuses to see her as anything apart from a complex existential situation. The husband, the rational medical husband, doesn't see her as someone who's really suffering. He more or less considers her as someone who's sort of suffering because she's self-indulgent or self-absorbed into herself, right? So, and that crisis communication, that crisis in clarity is something which is running throughout the story, and that's something which is part of the critique of medical science that she is offering as a writer and also as a sufferer. Okay, and then at this point in this story, we are told clearly for the first time that this is a discovery that she makes. It's almost like an epiphany moment for her when she realizes there is actually a woman behind the patterns. And this is what she says: I really have discovered something at last. Through watching so much at night, when it changes so, I finally found out. The front pattern does move, and no wonder the woman behind shakes it. Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one, and she crawls around fast, and a crawling shakes it all over. So the sense of finding or seeing one woman behind the patterns, behind the entire symmetry, the very extraordinary symmetry that she suffers, that sense of finding a woman is the beginning of association. I mean, obviously we find at the end of the story that she is a woman, and that the woman becomes a symbolic figure trapped in a particular kind of existence, trapped in patterns which are painful in quality, in the same way that the medical treatment which is conferred on her is painfully coercive in quality. And then she says quite clearly, sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one, and she crawls around fast, and a crawling shakes it all over. Then in the very bright spots she keeps still, and in the very shady spots she just takes hold of the bars and shakes them hard. So the whole idea of being imprisoned comes very visually over here. There's this woman who happens or who seems to be imprisoned behind bars. So that becomes a very symbolic position, that becomes a very symbolically spatial position, because, in the same way that she's imprisoned in this patriarchal medical system, that she doesn't really have an agency to emancipate herself, or forget about emancipation, to even assert herself. She's not even allowed to write. Writing is denied to her. Writing is something which is forbidden for her to do. And then that kind of imprisonment, discursive experiential imprisonment, or apparatus of imprisonment, is something that she sees in a woman as well in that wallpaper. And she says that another woman happens to just take hold of the bars and shakes them hard. And she's all the time trying to climb through, but nobody could climb through the pattern. It strangles so. Now we can see the associations quite clearly. The woman in the wallpaper is trying to climb out of the wallpaper, climb out of the patterns, but then she, the protagonist, realizes it's impossible to climb through the patterns because the patterns either strangle you, to repress you existentially and agentically, right? So that association is beginning to really become palpable in quality. I think that is why it has so many heads. They get through, and then the pattern strangles them off and turns them upside down and makes the eyes white. So this very morbid image, this very gory image of strangulation over here, is a very symbolic image, because that's the kind of image that's experienced that she's suffering as well as a human subject, that she's being strangled and strangulated by all these patterns of patterns of control, patterns of medical control, patterns of patriarchal control. If those heads were covered or taken off, it would not be half so bad. And then she tells us, and this is part of a confession narrative, as we know, this is part of a diary writing narrative. I think the woman gets out in the daytime. And I'll tell you why. Privately, I have seen her. So this is the beginning of the palpable connection that she has with the woman, that I've seen her. I've seen her get out of the daytime. I've actually visualized, not just visualized, I've actually experienced her visually. I can see her out of every one of my windows. It's the same woman, I know, for she's always creeping, and most women do not creep by daylight. So the movement over here is obviously one of non-agency. She's creeping around. She is not someone who is proudly walking around, even in the daylight. She is sort of moving around in a very skulky kind of fashion. I see her in that long shaded lane, creeping up and down. I see her in those dark grape arbors, creeping all around the garden. I see her on that long road under the trees, creeping along, and when a carriage comes, she hides under the blackberry vines. I don't blame her a bit. It must be very humiliating to be caught creeping by daylight. I always lock the door when I creep by daylight. I can't do it at night, for I know John would suspect something at once. And John is so queer now that I don't want to irritate him. I wish he would take another room. Besides, I don't want anyone to get that woman out at night but myself. So you can see how she is beginning to get associated with a woman. She's begun to get close with a woman. And when she says quite clearly, I don't want anybody to get that woman out at night but myself. So I want to only connect with her. I want to only touch with her. So I need to be the only person. I want to be the only person who would have any association with her. I don't want anyone else around her at all. And then she says that, and I don't blame her creeping around. It must be humiliating to be caught creeping by daylight. So the whole idea of humiliation becomes important here, because that's what she is. She's humiliated. She's humiliated by the way she's treated by the medical male figures. She's humiliated by the way she's been confined. She's humiliated by the way that she's been forced to take rest and subjected to the rest cure method that she part of over here. That figure of humiliation, that experience of being humiliated, is something which connects her with the woman in the wallpaper. I often wonder if I could see her out of all the windows at once, but turn as fast as I can only see out of one at one time. And though I always see her, she may be able to creep faster than I can turn. I have watched her sometimes away off in the open country, creeping as fast as a cloud shadow in a high wind. Right? So the whole idea of being able to see the woman, the whole idea of feeling sorry for the woman, is the beginning of the association, is the beginning of the affiliation that she begins to experience with the woman figure over here. Okay, so it's something that she say, and how what's interesting is for us to understand is how the material and metaphorical are merging with each other. So, and that's something which becomes part of the complex cognitive condition that she's experiencing. And she says over here quite clearly that there are only 2 more days to get this paper off. So she's trying to get the paper off, the yellow wallpaper off, and I believe John is beginning to notice. I don't like the look in his eyes. And I heard him ask Jenny a lot of professional questions about me. She had a very good report to give. So again, if we look at the adjectives, if we look at the words over here, John is asking a lot of professional questions about me. So it's not really human questions, it's not really emotional questions. He's always been the doctor, he's always been a male medical figure. is asking the nurse, Jenny over here, essentially the nurse, about the condition of the woman. So there's no direct connection, there's no direct conversation that he's having or even wanting to have with his wife. So he's asking questions to Jenny, and Jenny is giving a very good report about her. So again, the word report, the word professional, all these very medical words, very medical epithets and adjectives and classifications, and that's something which is really making it more claustrophobic for her. There's no human connect at all that she is experiencing, that she's able to associate with. Okay, and then we are told that he asked me all sorts of questions too and pretended to be very loving and kind. So the word pretended is the operative word over here. So she's able to understand that he's pretending, and we see quite clearly that she's telling immediately after, as if I couldn't see through him. Right, so I'm able to see through him now. I'm able to see through all the patriarchal pretensions of love and care and protection, which I know by now are all a subterfuge for complex techniques of coercion and containment. Right, so all this pretension to be protective, all this pretension to be loving is essentially a maneuver for patriarchy, a maneuver to sort of control and contain and confine and coerce the female subject into a corrective method. Right? Still, I don't wonder he acts so sleeping under his paper for 3 months. It only interests me, but I feel sure John and Jenny are secretly affected by it. And now we come to the last bit, the last day, and then we told her how she's been secretly trying to get the wallpaper off the wall, because that act of taking the wallpaper off becomes symbolically an act of liberation, an act of emancipation for her. And then she says, hooray, this is the last day, but it is enough, John, to say, stay in town overnight and won't be out until this evening, so I have the time to do my rebellious act of taking the wallpaper down. Jenny wanted to sleep with me, that sly thing. So if you notice, the adjectives are becoming different, that she's able to see through John, she's able to see Jenny as a sly thing, someone who is completely complicit with the patriarchal protection narrative, the patriarchal confinement narrative. But I told her I should undoubtedly rest better for a night all alone. That was clever, for really I wasn't alone a bit. As soon as it was moonlight and that poor thing began to crawl and shake the pattern, I got up and ran to help her. So, she's now trying to help the poor thing. So there's a degree of pity, empathy that has been established with the figure in the wallpaper. And she's saying that the moment I saw the poor thing begin to crawl and shake the pattern, and got up and ran to help her. So she's now able to see herself as an assistant, as a fellow sufferer, as a comrade in crisis with the the figure in the wallpaper. I pulled and she shook. I shook and she pulled. And before morning we had peeled off yards of that paper. So it was an overnight work, and then by the time morning arrived, we had been able to take off the wallpaper more or less. A strip was about as high in my head and half around the room. And then when the sun came and that awful pattern began to laugh at me, I declared that I would finish it today. So this idea of declaring I'd finish it today becomes an act of an assertion of agency. And now you see how she's becoming more and more agentic in quality, and now she's touching a different order of embodiment, as it were, a more agentic, a more purposeful, a more motivated order of embodiment, compared to the very passive order that she's been subjected to all the time by the medical method. We go away tomorrow, and they're moving all my furniture down again to leave things as they were before. Jenny looked at the wall in amazement, but I told her merrily that I did it out of pure spite at the vicious thing. She laughed and said she wouldn't mind doing it herself, but I must not get tired. How she betrayed herself that time. So now she's able to see through the machinations, the deceptions of Jenny and her husband, John. But I'm here, and no person touches the paper but me, not alive. So now we can see the sense of protectiveness which is beginning to emerge over here. How she's trying to say that no one has access, no one has an agency to touch the wallpaper but me. She tried to get me out of the room. It was too patent. But I said it was so quiet and empty and clean that now that I believed I would lie down again and sleep all I could, and not to wake me even for dinner. I would call when I woke. So now we see the voice of agency coming in, that she is demanding to be left alone. She's instructing Jenny that she should not disturb her. If she wants to have dinner, she would call when I woke. So she's now reasserting her agency bit by bit. So now she is gone, and the servants are gone, and the things are gone, and there's nothing left but that great bedstead nailed down with the canvas mattress we found on it. We shall sleep downstairs tonight and take the boat home tomorrow. I quite enjoy the room. Now it is bare again. And how those children did tear about here. This bedstead is fairly gnawed. but I must get to work. I've locked the door and thrown the key down into the front path. I don't want to go out, and I don't want to have anybody come in till John comes. I want to astonish him. So there's a sense of violence in the word astonish over here. So this is a sense of retaliation that we see. I want to astonish John when he comes back. So you find how it becomes slightly Gothic in quality towards the end, and there's a detective story quality, that is a suspense building up, and now we're going to have a revelation scene at the end. So I'll stop at this point, and we'll continue with this in the next lecture, but it's important to see how she's beginning to acquire agency, how she's begun to enjoy agency, and that acquirement of agency, the procurement of agency is what makes her more assertive in quality, and she's giving orders to be left alone. She's doing things, the activities are very agentic in quality, in terms of taking the wallpaper down, in terms of asking Jen to leave her alone, and in terms of throwing the key away, a very symbolic act, that I'll throw the key away. I want to be left untouched over here. I want to be left unaffected over here until John comes. And when John comes, I want to astonish him. So the whole idea of astonishing becomes an act of retaliation, an act of subversion. So it's a repossessing of agency. She owns back the agency which is denied to her, and moving away from the very passive position of being subjected to a cure method to an active position where she's doing things and trying things and asserting things, and now she's waiting for the husband to come back just so she can astonish him. And there's a sense of violence and retaliation about his desire to astonish. So astonish over here becomes a very loaded term. It's a very experiential term. It's something which is agentic in quality, and she wants to astonish him, and she knows she has ability to astonish him now. So I'll stop at this point today, and we'll conclude this text in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.